The letter hit the floor of the Fairchild Ranch house like a stone dropped into still water, and Georgia Pritchard watched the ripples spread across Harvey Fairchild's face with a kind of dread she had never expected to feel for a man she had known less than 4 months. "You lied to me." His voice was low, controlled, and somehow more devastating for its quietness. He stood at the far end of the kitchen, the crumpled paper in his fist, and the lantern light carved shadows into the hard lines of his jaw. "You told me you came here from Philadelphia because you wanted to teach. You told me the children were your only reason." Georgia did not flinch, but it took every ounce of the discipline she had learned in the 3 hardest years of her life not to. "I did come here to teach," she said. "That part was never a lie. Then what is this?" He held the letter up, and she could see her own handwriting on the page, the words she had written to her sister 6 weeks ago, the words she had been stupid enough to leave in the pocket of her coat on a day when the coat had been left on the kitchen chair and Harvey's eldest child, 9-year-old Eli, had gone looking for a pencil and found the letter instead. "You were sent here. Someone paid for your passage. Someone wanted you on my land." The fire in the hearth snapped and threw orange light across the rough-hewn walls. Outside, the Kansas wind was doing what it always did in late October of 1873, screaming down from the north like something with a grievance, rattling the window panes and making the whole house feel like a ship on a dark sea. Georgia took one breath, then another. "Yes," she said. "Someone paid for my passage, but it was not what you think, Harvey. If you will let me explain, my children trust you." The words landed like a slap, worse than any accusation about herself. "Eli reads aloud to me at night now. Clara draws letters in the dust before breakfast just to practice. My son, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in a row since his mother died, has been telling me stories at the supper table because of you, and you have been hiding something in this house the entire time." Georgia felt the guilt tear through her like a saw blade, because he was right. She had been hiding something. And the worst part, the part that kept her awake in the small hours when the coyotes called to each other across the dark flats, was that what she had been hiding had stopped mattering to her weeks ago. She had stopped being the woman who had a secret mission the moment she had sat down beside Eli Fairchild and watched the boy's face transform as he sounded out his first full sentence. She had stopped being anything other than herself the moment Harvey Fairchild had looked at her across a supper table and said, with complete sincerity, that she was the first person in 2 years who had made this house feel like a home. But she had never found the courage to confess, and now the confession had been taken from her, and the look on his face was the worst thing she had ever seen. "Sit down," she said softly. "Please, let me tell you everything from the beginning." He did not sit down. But he did not walk out either. He stood there in the lamplight, that crumpled letter still in his hand, and he waited. And Georgia Pritchard took the deepest breath of her life and started talking. She had grown up in the kind of poverty that Philadelphia liked to pretend did not exist inside its elegant city limits. Her father had been a schoolteacher himself, a gentle, bookish man who believed with his whole heart that education was the single greatest weapon against suffering, and who had died of typhoid when Georgia was 16, leaving her, her mother, and her younger sister Ruth with nothing but a house full of books and a debt to the landlord. Her mother had taken in sewing. Georgia had taken a position as a teacher's aide in one of the city's charity schools, where the children arrived hungry and left only slightly less hungry, and where the pay was barely enough to keep coal in the stove. She had been 24 years old when a man named Cornelius Vance had come to the charity school. He was a lawyer, impeccably dressed, with the kind of smooth, practiced manner that made everything he said sound reasonable even when your instincts were screaming. He represented, he said, the estate of one Thomas Fairchild of Hayden County, Kansas. Thomas Fairchild had died intestate, meaning without a will, and his considerable land holdings were in a state of legal confusion because his son, Harvey Fairchild, was refusing to cooperate with the estate proceedings. Georgia had told the lawyer politely that she did not see what any of this had to do with her. Cornelius Vance had smiled. It was the smile of a man who had already won before the conversation started. He needed someone on the Fairchild property, he explained. Someone who could be present without raising suspicion. Harvey Fairchild had 2 young children who needed educating, and the nearest schoolhouse was 11 miles away over Bad Road. If a qualified teacher were to present herself in Hayden County seeking a position as a live-in governess, Harvey Fairchild would almost certainly hire her. And while she was there, she would simply keep her eyes open, document what she saw, report back on the state of the land, the cattle operation, the finances. Nothing illegal, nothing harmful, just observation. In return, Cornelius Vance would pay off her mother's outstanding debts and provide Georgia with a sum of money large enough to fund the small school she had been dreaming of opening for years. Georgia had said no. She had said no 3 times over the course of 2 weeks, and each time Vance had found a new angle, a new pressure point. The 3rd time he had arrived with documents showing that her mother owed more than Georgia had known, that the landlord was preparing to take action, that Ruth, who was 18 and had no prospects except the ones Georgia could help her create, was in a genuinely precarious position. And Georgia, who loved her family with everything she had said yes. She had told herself it was harmless. She had told herself that she was not betraying anyone, that she was simply going to a place where she was needed, doing a job she was qualified to do, and incidentally keeping her eyes open. She had told herself that Harvey Fairchild was a wealthy landowner who would not even notice her presence except as a convenience, a woman hired to manage his children so he could manage his cattle. She had been catastrophically wrong about almost everything. Harvey was quiet for a long time after she finished. He had moved to the window at some point during her telling, and he stood with his back to her, looking out at the dark and the wind-bent grass. Georgia sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her heart hammering. "How much have you reported back to him?" he said finally without turning around. "Nothing," Georgia said. "Not a single word. I wrote to my sister, and I know that is what you found because in that letter I told Ruth that I would not be sending Vance any information. I told her I was done with the arrangement. I told her that whatever happened to the debt, I could not do what I had agreed to do." That was the letter Eli found. Harvey turned then, and the expression on his face was something she could not entirely read. "You told your sister you were backing out. When?" "6 weeks ago. The week after the first frost." He was calculating something. She could see it in his eyes. "That was the week you stayed up all night with Clara when she had the fever." "Yes. I came down at 3 in the morning and you were sitting beside her bed reading to her even though she was asleep. I did not want her to wake up alone." Something shifted in his face. Not softened exactly, but something. He moved to the table and sat down heavily across from her, and for the first time since he had picked up that letter, he looked less like a man preparing for a fight and more like a man trying to find the truth. "Tell me what Vance wanted," he said. "What he was really after." So Georgia told him that part too. And as she talked, she watched Harvey's expression change from guarded to grim, and she realized that he already knew more than he had let on. He knew about Cornelius Vance. He knew about the contested estate. He had been navigating a legal threat to his land for nearly a year, ever since his father Thomas had died, and he had not been doing it alone, but he had been doing it with very few people he trusted. And the idea that a spy had been planted in his own home, in his own kitchen, teaching his own children, had clearly cut him somewhere much deeper than legal strategy. "I was not going to use what I saw," Georgia said for the 3rd time. "I know that does not undo the fact that I came here under false pretenses. I know you have every right to ask me to leave tonight, but I need you to know that the moment I met your children, the moment I walked into this house, what Vance wanted became something I was not capable of doing." Harvey looked at her for a long, searching moment. "Why?" The question was simple and devastating. Georgia opened her mouth, and what came out was not the careful, reasonable answer she had prepared. What came out was the truth. "Because this is a real home," she said, "even broken as it is, even grieving as all three of you still are. There is something in this house that is worth protecting. And I was not willing to be the person who let it be taken apart. The fire crackled. The wind outside made its grievances known. Harvey Fairchild sat across the kitchen table from Georgia Pritchard and looked at her with eyes that had been through too much, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, the way a man's posture changes when he has been braced for a blow that does not come. "I'm not going to ask you to leave," he said finally, "but I need to know that everything from here on is honest." "Everything from here on is honest," Georgia said. "I promise you that." He nodded once, pushed back from the table, and walked out of the kitchen without another word. Georgia sat alone for a long time, listening to the fire and the wind and the sound of her own heartbeat, and she understood that she had just passed through something. She was not sure yet what was on the other side of it, but she was certain, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Now she needed to tell the whole story, the one that had started not in crisis but in an ordinary kind of hope, the way most real things start. Georgia Pritchard had arrived in Hayden County, Kansas, on a Tuesday morning in late June of 1873, on the back of a mail coach that had been carrying, besides herself, 3 crates of dry goods, a minister who talked incessantly about providence, and a dog of uncertain breed that the driver refused to acknowledge was there. The town of Hayden itself was not much to speak of, a main street of packed dirt flanked by a general store, a livery, a saloon that also served as the post office, and a church so new that the paint was still tacky. The surrounding country, though, was something else. The grassland stretched away in every direction in long, slow waves of gold and green that moved like breathing, and the sky above them was the kind of blue that made you feel both very small and very lucky to be alive. She had presented herself at the general store, which was run by a woman named Mrs. Opal Dempsey, who had the face of someone who had seen everything twice and been impressed by none of it the second time. Georgia had asked directions to the Fairchild Ranch, and Mrs. Dempsey had given her a look that contained a complicated mixture of sympathy and speculation. "Harvey Fairchild," the woman had said, in the tone people use when they are deciding how much to tell you. "Lost his wife 14 months ago. Clara Fairchild, she was a sweet woman. Fever took her in the spring. He's got 2 children, Eli who's 9 and little Clara who's 5, named for her mother. He's a hard-working man, a fair man, not an easy man but a fair one." Georgia had thanked her and arranged for the mail coach driver to take her the remaining 4 miles to the ranch, since her trunk was too heavy to carry, and she had not yet acquired any other method of transport. Harvey Fairchild had been mending a section of fence when the mail coach rattled up the road to his gate. She had seen him before he saw her, a tall man in a worn canvas coat, dark hair with the first threads of gray at the temples, moving with the deliberate efficiency of someone who had learned long ago to conserve energy because the work never ended. He was 32 years old, she had been told. He looked in that first moment like a man who was carrying a great deal of weight and had decided a long time ago that there was no point in putting it down. He had looked at her with a kind of careful reserve, the way a man looks at something he is not entirely sure about but is willing to consider. "Miss Pritchard," he had said, because she had sent a letter ahead of herself, carefully worded, entirely focused on her qualifications and her love of teaching, mentioning nothing about Cornelius Vance or contested estates. "I got your letter. I hope the references were satisfactory," she had said. They were. He had looked at her trunk, then back at her, then over his shoulder at the house. "Eli," he had called, and a boy had appeared in the doorway of the house, all sharp angles and watchful eyes, the kind of child who is quiet not because he lacks intelligence but because he has learned that the world rewards caution. "Come meet your teacher." The children had been, in those first weeks, the entire focus of Georgia's world, and she would not have had it any other way. Eli Fairchild was 9 years old and had the internal life of someone much older, the consequence of having lost his mother at 8, and having spent the intervening year watching his father work himself toward numbness. He was not a difficult child. He was a child who had built walls, and he let Georgia approach them carefully, testing her at every step with small, quiet challenges, seeing whether she would stay or whether she was the kind of person who disappeared. He had seen people disappear. He knew what it looked like. Clara Fairchild was 5 years old and named for the mother she barely remembered, and she was the kind of child who made you believe in fundamental goodness, open-faced and curious, and so full of feeling that she seemed to vibrate with it. She had attached herself to Georgia within the first 3 days with the uncomplicated trust of a child who needs something and recognizes when it arrives. Georgia had set up a classroom of sorts in the room Harvey designated for the purpose, a small room off the main hall with a south-facing window that let in good light. She had brought her books from Philadelphia, a considerable collection given that she had been traveling light in every other respect, and she had arranged them on a set of shelves she and Eli had built together from spare lumber, which had been the first act of cooperation that had begun to chip away at the boy's careful wariness. She taught Eli reading and arithmetic and basic history and geography, using a large illustrated atlas that had been her father's. She taught Clara her letters and her numbers through songs and stories and games played in the dust outside the kitchen door. She taught both children to observe the world around them with attention and language, to look at the grass bending in the wind and find words for it, to notice the difference between the call of a meadowlark and the call of a red-tailed hawk, to understand that paying attention was itself a form of intelligence. Harvey watched from a distance those first weeks. He was not a distant father in the way of men who have no interest in their children. He was a man who was afraid of doing it wrong, who had loved his wife with a quiet, steady devotion, and had been left by her death with 2 children he would die for, and a profound uncertainty about whether he was adequate to the task of raising them. He ate breakfast and supper with them every day. He checked on them in the evenings. But there was a space around him, an invisible perimeter, and Georgia recognized it because she had seen it before in children who had been hurt, and she was careful not to push. The first time the perimeter shifted was on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of July. Georgia had been reading aloud to the children after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara on her lap and Eli beside her, working through a collection of poetry that had been her father's favorite. She had been reading Longfellow, the rhythmic lines of The Song of Hiawatha, which the children liked because of the sound of it, the way the words moved like something physical. She had not heard Harvey come in from the barn, and she did not realize he was standing in the doorway until she turned a page and caught the movement in her peripheral vision. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms folded and his expression difficult to interpret, but he did not leave, and he did not ask her to stop. He stood there for the better part of 20 minutes while Georgia read, and when she finally finished the passage and looked up, he met her eyes for just a moment before he pushed off from the door and went to wash his hands for the evening and said nothing. But the next evening he was there again, and this time he sat down. It became a habit without either of them deciding it would. Harvey Fairchild, who had spent the last 14 months building a wall around himself brick by careful brick, who had worked from first light to last light every day as though exhaustion were the only reliable cure for grief, started spending his evenings in the kitchen listening to his children's teacher read aloud. At first he said nothing. He just sat at the end of the table with his coffee and listened. But gradually, over the weeks that followed, he began to contribute. A question about a historical event Georgia mentioned, a correction to a geographical point about Kansas. Once, unexpectedly, a joke, a dry, understated piece of humor that had both children dissolving into laughter and Georgia looking at him in a surprise that she quickly hid because she did not want him to feel self-conscious about the fact that he had just shown her something real. She started to see who he was underneath the grief and the guardedness. He was a man who had read widely, who had opinions about things, who cared with a fierce, quiet intensity about what was right and what was not. His father Thomas had built the ranch from raw land in the early 1860s, and Harvey had worked beside him from the time he was tall enough to be useful, and he had learned from Thomas both the practical skills of running a cattle operation and a set of values that he held onto with both hands. He believed in honest dealing. He believed in the worth of hard work. He believed that land was not just property, but responsibility, something entrusted to you by the generations before and the generations after. He had married Clara Hendricks when he was 26 and she was 24, and he had loved her with the kind of love that does not make speeches, that shows itself in small consistencies over years rather than grand gestures in moments. When Clara had died of fever in the spring of 1872, something in Harvey had locked. He had kept functioning because there was no alternative, because there were children who needed him and cattle that needed tending and land that needed managing. But the part of him that had been open to the world had closed like a door in winter, and he had told himself, without quite putting it into words, that it would stay closed. He had not counted on Georgia Pritchard. She started to understand this sometime in August, when the Kansas heat lay across the land like a physical weight, and the evenings brought only a slight softening of it. She had been helping Eli work through a problem in long division, sitting beside him at the table with their heads close together over the slate, and she had looked up to find Harvey watching them from the opposite side of the table with an expression she had not seen on him before. It was not quite longing. It was something quieter than that and more complicated, the look of a man who is being reminded of something he thought he had given up. She looked away quickly. But her heart did something embarrassing and involuntary, and she spent the next several evenings being very careful about where she put her eyes. The problem was that every time she resolved to maintain a proper professional distance, Harvey Fairchild did something that demolished the resolution entirely. He came in from a long day on the range one afternoon in late August to find Georgia sitting on the porch steps teaching Clara a clapping game, both of them laughing in the golden late afternoon light, and he stopped walking and looked at them for such a long, unguarded moment that Georgia saw it and he knew she had seen it, and neither of them said anything, but something changed in the air between them that did not change back. He mended the roof of the small room she used as a schoolroom without being asked, on a Sunday when the children were playing, just appeared with tools and lumber and did it quietly while Georgia watched from the window and tried to understand the feeling in her chest. He began to ask her questions, not about the children but about her, where she had grown up, what her father had been like, what had made her want to teach. He asked these questions in the evenings, after the children were in bed, sitting across the kitchen table with his coffee, and Georgia answered carefully at first and then less carefully. And then one September night she had talked for an hour about her father and the charity school and the vision she had of what education could be. And when she finally stopped and looked at Harvey in some embarrassment at having said so much, he was looking at her with an expression of complete attention that was more disarming than any compliment. "You should have that school," he said. "The one you're describing. Those children deserve what you could give them." "Maybe someday," Georgia said. "Not someday," he said, with the straightforward conviction she was coming to know as fundamentally him. "You're too good at this for it to be someday." She had gone to bed that night with her face warm and her thoughts in complete disorder. September moved into October, and the problem of Cornelius Vance reasserted itself in Georgia's mind with growing urgency. She had sent the lawyer a single brief letter in July, shortly after her arrival, confirming that she was in place, and had heard nothing since. She had been bracing herself for a follow-up, a demand for information, a tightening of the arrangement she had agreed to. The longer silence went on, the more certain she became that Vance was simply waiting, letting her settle in, letting her become embedded enough in the household to see things he wanted seen. The awareness of this was a constant low-level distress, a splinter she could not reach. She had made her decision in the first week of October, when Harvey had taken the children to town for supplies and she had been alone in the house with too much time to think. She had sat down at the kitchen table with paper and pen and written the letter to her sister Ruth that would eventually be found in her coat pocket and would blow everything apart. In that letter she had told Ruth that she was done, that she would find another way to deal with the debts, that she would work and save and find a way, but that she could not do what Vance had paid her to do, that she was not willing to harm these people, that something had happened to her in this house that she could not fully explain but that she was not willing to betray. She had written that, and then she had folded the letter, addressed it, and put it in her coat pocket intending to take it to town for posting. And then Eli had come home with a cold, and Clara had gotten into a dispute with a chicken that had ended with Clara in tears, and the chicken apparently vindicated. And Georgia had hung up her coat and forgotten about the letter until it was too late. Now, on the other side of the confrontation with Harvey's quiet, "I'm not going to ask you to leave," still sitting in her chest like something fragile and precious, Georgia had a new problem. Vance had not gone away. He had simply been quiet, and Harvey needed to know what the man was actually after. The next morning, Georgia came downstairs to find Harvey already at the kitchen table, not with his usual early morning efficiency, but with a map spread out before him and several papers, and the look of a man who has been thinking through something all night. "Sit down," he said, and it was not the same command he had made the night before. It was an invitation. Georgia sat. "I want you to tell me everything Vance told you about the estate," Harvey said. "Everything. What he said the legal situation was, who he said he represented exactly, what he wanted you to look for." Georgia told him, all of it in as much detail as she could recall. Harvey listened without interrupting, making notes on a piece of paper in his careful, economical handwriting. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "My father left the ranch to me," he said. "That was always the understanding. There was no formal will because Thomas Fairchild was a man who believed his word was as good as a document, which was one of his finer qualities and also, as it turns out, one of his more costly ones. When he died last year, 3 separate parties materialized claiming some right to the estate. 2 of them were frivolous and I settled them quickly. Vance's client is not frivolous." "Who is his client?" Georgia asked. "A man named Doyle Bennett. He came to this country from Ohio in 1860, the same year my father did, and he and my father had a partnership arrangement for the first 3 years. They built the first structures on this land together, ran a shared herd for 2 seasons. Then they had a disagreement, a serious one, about how the operation should be run, and Bennett left. My father bought him out. He signed a paper acknowledging receipt of the buyout payment and relinquishing his claim on the property. I have that paper. Then the claim should be easy to defeat," Georgia said. "It would be, except that the paper has disappeared." Harvey's voice was flat and controlled. "It was in my father's strongbox, which I went through after his death. It is not there now. Someone removed it." The implication settled over Georgia like cold water. Vance was looking for information about where the document might have gone, or confirmation that it was gone. If I can't produce that buyout agreement, Bennett's claim becomes considerably more complicated to counter. The law out here is not always refined, Miss Pritchard. Courts make decisions based on what they can see. Georgia thought about this. Is there any other evidence of the buyout? Anyone who witnessed it? One man, a lawyer in Wichita named Aldous Crane, who drew up the agreement in 1863. I've been trying to reach him for 6 months. His office confirmed he's alive but has been ill and traveling between sanitariums. Harvey paused. There's something else. He picked up one of the papers and slid it across to her. It was a letter, formal in tone, from a court in Hayden County, advising Harvey Fairchild that Doyle Bennett had filed a formal claim and that a hearing would be held on the matter on the 15th of November. That was 3 weeks away. Georgia read the letter twice. "What do you need?" Harvey looked at her directly, and the look contained something that made her breath catch. "I need to find Aldous Crane." I need his testimony in person or in writing, confirming that he drew up that document and that Bennett signed it. You need to go to Wichita. I need to go to Wichita, but I cannot take the children on that ride and I cannot leave them alone. He paused, and the pause was weighted with something that was more than practicality. I am asking whether you will stay and look after them while I go. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything right now. I know what you've told me and I know it complicates everything. But the children trust you and yes, Georgia said. She did not let him finish. Of course I will stay. Something in Harvey's face shifted, and it was not relief exactly. It was more than relief. It was the look of a man who has been offered something he was not entirely sure he deserved. I'll leave tomorrow morning, he said. I should be back within 2 weeks. Be careful, Georgia said, and then felt immediately self-conscious about the plainness of it, the way the 2 words carried more weight than she had intended. Harvey looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, then nodded once and turned back to his map. He left at first light the next day on a dark bay gelding named Augustus, with provisions for 10 days and the careful, purposeful energy of a man with a mission. Georgia stood in the yard with Eli and Clara and watched him ride until the road crested the hill and took him from sight. Clara put her hand in Georgia's. Eli stood with his arms folded, imitating his father's stance without knowing he was doing it, and Georgia had to press her lips together to keep the emotion from showing. Right, she said in her most practical voice. Who can tell me the capital of Kansas? Eli gave her a look. Topeka, he said. We've done this. Then who can tell me the population of Topeka in the last census? That one stumped him, and the morning had its purpose, and the children were occupied, and Georgia did not stand at the kitchen window looking north toward the road until after they were in bed. The 2 weeks without Harvey in the house were revealing in ways Georgia had not anticipated. She had not understood, until he was gone, how much of her daily sense of groundedness had come from the simple fact of his presence. Not from anything he said or did, but from the particular quality of attention he brought to his own life, the way he moved through the world with a kind of deliberate honesty that she found more stabilizing than she had realized. She kept the children on their school schedule. She read to them in the evenings. She managed the household as best she could, with help from the ranch's 2 hired hands, a quiet young man named Tobias, and an older one named Hector who had worked for Thomas Fairchild and stayed on out of loyalty and practical necessity. She learned more about running a cattle ranch in those 2 weeks than she had learned in the previous 4 months, because necessity is a remarkable teacher. She also dealt with a visit from Cornelius Vance. He arrived on the 6th day of Harvey's absence, riding in on a hired horse with the ease of a man who was accustomed to having his presence found unwelcome and had simply stopped caring. He was somewhere in his 40s, with a city man's hands and a city man's coat, and he looked at the Fairchild property with the evaluating gaze of someone calculating its worth. Georgia met him in the yard, and she kept her voice entirely steady. "Mr. Vance," she said, "I did not expect you." "No, I don't imagine you did." He looked around, noting the absence of Harvey's horse, the absence of Harvey. "Fairchild's away, I hear, gone to Wichita." The fact that he knew this so quickly told Georgia several things, none of them comfortable. She kept her face neutral. "I'm afraid this is not a good time for a visit. The children are at their lessons." "I'm not here to see the children." He looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze she remembered from their meetings in Philadelphia, the gaze of a man who believed he was always in the stronger position. "You haven't sent any reports." "I sent a letter," Georgia said. "I told you I was not going to." "You did." He was not angry. That was the disturbing thing. He was calm and pleasant in the manner of someone who has anticipated this and made contingency plans. "I've made allowances for the adjustment period. But Miss Pritchard, I need to remind you of the terms of our arrangement, your mother's debts, your sister's situation." "My mother's debts are being managed," Georgia said, which was not entirely true, but she said it without flinching. And my sister is an adult woman who is capable of managing her own situation. I told you in my letter that I am not going to do what you asked me to do. That has not changed." Vance looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something harden behind his pleasant expression, a glimpse of the actual mechanism beneath the social surface. "What happened to you, Miss Pritchard? A few months on a cattle ranch and you've forgotten what we agreed to." "I have not forgotten," Georgia said. "I've decided it was wrong. Those are different things. You came here under false pretenses. You told Harvey Fairchild you were simply a teacher looking for a position. If he were to learn the full truth of your arrangement with me—" "He already knows," Georgia said, and was gratified by the brief, genuine surprise that crossed Vance's face. "He has known for several days. I told him myself." A pause. Vance recalculated. "Then you've made your position here quite precarious." "Mr. Vance," Georgia said, and she made her voice very clear and very steady because she had been thinking about this conversation for weeks and she knew exactly what she needed to say. "If you have a legitimate legal claim on this property, pursue it through the courts. That is what courts are for. But you do not have a legitimate claim, because the only man who might have had one signed it away 10 years ago, and no amount of sending people here to look through someone's private life is going to change that. I am not going to help you, I am not going to report to you, and if you come to this property again while I am on it, I will send for the county sheriff." Vance looked at her for a long, measuring moment. Then he made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "You're very certain of yourself," he said. "About this," Georgia said. "Yes." He rode away without another word, and Georgia stood in the yard and shook once from head to toe, and then squared her shoulders and went back inside to her children. Harvey returned on the 13th day. He rode up the road in the late afternoon light, dusty and travel-worn, and the children were in the yard and saw him first and ran to meet him with a noise and enthusiasm that Georgia watched from the porch with a feeling in her chest that was too large and too complicated to examine just yet. Harvey dismounted, went to one knee in the dust, and caught both children at once, holding them with his eyes closed for just a moment, and Georgia looked away because the image felt too private for observation. When he came up the porch steps, he looked at her with something in his face that was different from when he had left, lighter in some way. Like a man who had been carrying a stone and had found somewhere to set it down. "I found Aldous Crane," he said. "Tell me." They sat at the kitchen table while the children played outside, and Harvey told her. Crane had been in Wichita in a boarding house near the edge of town, recovering from a chest ailment that had been wearing him down for months. He was a small, precise man in his 60s who remembered the Bennett Fairchild transaction clearly because, as he put it, he had found Doyle Bennett to be one of the most disagreeable men he had ever done business with, and the memory of seeing him forced to sign away his claim had given him satisfaction that he had recalled many times since. Crane had not only provided Harvey with a notarized written statement, he had also told Harvey something else. He had kept a copy of the original buyout document in his own records, as was his standard practice, and that copy still existed. Harvey had the copy, he had the notarized statement, he had what he needed for the hearing. Georgia felt the relief move through her like warm water. "When is the hearing?" "November 15th. 11 days. He looked at her steadily. "Vance came here while I was gone. Hector told me he saw a man on a hired horse." "Yes," Georgia said. "He came on the 6th day I sent him away." Harvey's eyes held something intense. "How?" "I told him you knew everything that I had told you, and that if he came back I would send for the sheriff." A silence. Then Harvey said, "You did that alone. There was no one else to do it." He looked at her for a long moment, and the look was complex and warm and direct, and Georgia felt it like sunlight on skin that had been cold for too long. "I owe you considerably more than a teaching wage," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not quite humor and not quite tenderness but was near both. "You don't owe me anything," Georgia said. "I'm still settling a debt of my own." "You were going to tell me more about that," Harvey said. "About whether you fixed the situation with your mother's debts." Georgia was quiet for a moment. I have most of what I need. I've been saving from what you pay me. It will take a few more months." "A few more months," Harvey repeated. He paused, then carefully measuring each word. "I was hoping you'd be here at least that long." Georgia looked at the table. "I was hoping to be," she said. The 11th of November arrived with the first real cold of the season. A sharp-edged morning with frost on the window panes, and the grass laid flat in silver. Georgia woke early and came downstairs to find Harvey already at the kitchen stove, which was unusual, and the smell of coffee already in the air, and she stood in the doorway in a state of early morning dishevelment that she immediately felt self-conscious about. He looked around at her, and there was something almost shy in his expression, which she would never have expected from him. "Sit down," he said, for what felt like the 100th time, but this time it was different from all the others. This time it was an invitation to sit not at a table of crisis or strategy, but just at a table with coffee and morning light and him. "I've been thinking," he said, when she had sat and he had poured coffee for both of them and settled across from her in the chair that had become his chair in the evenings, the one positioned so he could see the door and the window both, the arrangement of a man who has been a rancher all his life and is accustomed to keeping track of multiple things at once. "That sounds serious," Georgia said. "It is, and it isn't." He wrapped both hands around his cup in the way he always did, as if warming them, and looked at the surface of the coffee for a moment before he looked up at her. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I am not a man who does well with indirectness." "I know," Georgia said. "It's one of the things She stopped, recalibrated. "Go ahead." He noticed the pause. Of course he did. He noticed everything, which was both wonderful and terrifying. "You came here under circumstances that were not straightforward. I know that. And you told me the truth when you didn't have to, and you faced Vance alone on my behalf, and you have spent every day since you arrived making this house into something my children and I can live in rather than just exist in." He paused. "I have not been easy to be around. I know that too. You've been," she searched for the word, "honest. You've been honest with me, even when you were angry, even when you were guarded. You never pretended to be something you weren't, and I have valued that more than you know, especially given what I came here pretending to be." Harvey was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove clicked and breathed. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "So I need you to understand that when I say that the last 4 months have been the first time since Clara died that I have felt like a person who might have something ahead of him as well as behind him, I mean that exactly." Georgia's hands tightened around her cup. Her heart was doing something undignified and completely outside her control. "Harvey, I'm not asking you to do anything you're not ready for," he said. "I'm not asking you to make any decision. I'm just telling you that I'd like there to be the possibility of something, when the timing is right, when things are settled, when you've had time to decide what you want and it's a free decision, not one made out of obligation or circumstance." Georgia looked at him across the table, this man who had spent 4 months slowly revealing himself to her, who had sat in his kitchen listening to poetry when he had never been a man who sat still, who had mended her schoolroom roof without being asked, and gone to Wichita for 2 weeks to fight for what was his, and come back, and asked how she had managed in his absence before he had said a single word about himself. This man who could not say a tender thing without first making absolutely sure it was true. "I have already decided," she said. The morning light came through the window between them. Harvey looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, open and careful and bright, like a door swinging wide on its hinges, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wasn't already said, and it was the most eloquent silence she had ever heard. The hearing on the 15th of November was held in Hayden's small courthouse, a room that smelled of pine and dust and the accumulated weight of people's difficulties. Georgia had offered to stay with the children, but Harvey had said no. He had said he wanted her there. He had said it the way he said things that mattered, simply and completely. They went together, all 4 of them, Georgia and Harvey and Eli and Clara, and they sat in the wooden gallery while the judge, a heavy-set man named Hollies who had the expression of someone who had long since ceased to be surprised by human behavior, presided over the proceedings. Doyle Bennett was a man in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulder with the look of someone who had once been physically impressive and had let it run to hardness rather than softness as he aged. He sat at his table with Cornelius Vance beside him, and Vance looked at Georgia once across the room with an expression that conceded nothing but accepted reality, and then looked away. Harvey's case was presented by a local lawyer named Whitfield who had the kind of methodical competence that is less dramatic than brilliance but more reliable. The notarized statement from Aldous Crane was entered into evidence. The copy of the buyout agreement was produced. Bennett's lawyer argued that the copy was not the original and its provenance was questionable. Whitfield pointed out, with calm precision, that Aldous Crane was a licensed attorney of 30 years standing whose record-keeping practices were a matter of professional obligation, and that the document had his signature and seal. Judge Hollies read the copy twice, read Crane's statement, looked over his glasses at Doyle Bennett, and asked whether there was any other evidence of Bennett's claim. There was not. The ruling was brief and definitive. The Fairchild property was confirmed to be the sole property of Harvey James Fairchild, and the claim filed by Doyle Bennett was dismissed without prejudice. Vance gathered his papers with the smooth efficiency of a man who knew when a battle was over, and he and Bennett left without looking back. Georgia watched them go and felt something she could only describe as the final laying down of a weight she had not realized she was still carrying. Harvey stood up slowly. He looked at his lawyer, shook the man's hand, clapped him on the shoulder. Then he turned and looked at Georgia and the children, and the expression on his face was so unguarded and so purely glad that Clara made a noise of confusion. "Papa, why do you look funny?" Clara asked. "Because I'm happy," Harvey said. "I forgot for a while what that felt like." He looked at Georgia when he said it. She looked back at him, and around them Eli and Clara were asking questions and the courtroom was emptying, and outside the Kansas sky was enormous and clear and cold, and everything that had been complicated became, for a moment, very simple. They drove home in the buckboard in the early afternoon, with the children bundled between them under a lap blanket, and the road running straight ahead through the golden grass. Eli fell asleep against Harvey's arm somewhere around the 2nd mile, and Clara fell asleep against Georgia's arm around the 3rd, and Harvey and Georgia looked at each other over the sleeping heads of his children, and something passed between them that was as natural and as settled as the land around them. December arrived, and with it the deep winter of the Kansas plains, which was not the picturesque snowfall of the eastern states but a serious, sustained cold that required preparation and attention and mutual dependence. The ranch turned inward. The schoolroom lessons continued by the fire. The evenings grew longer and the kitchen fire burned higher, and the four of them found the rhythms of a household that was becoming, slowly and without ceremony, something unified. Georgia wrote to her mother and her sister. She told them, carefully, as much of the truth as she could fit into a letter. She told them about the children, about the land, about the outcome of the legal proceedings. She told them that she was well. She did not yet say the other things, the things that were still too new and too tender to commit to paper, but she thought Ruth would read between the lines because Ruth was perceptive, and because Georgia's letters had changed in tone over the past 5 months in ways that were probably visible to someone who knew her. She had one more conversation with Harvey about Vance and the whole of what she had been asked to do. A long, honest, kitchen-table conversation that took up most of one December evening after the children were in bed, in which they went over every detail and Harvey asked every question he needed to ask and Georgia answered every one without omission. And at the end of it, Harvey sat back and said, "I've been thinking about how to say something for the last 3 weeks." "Then say it," Georgia said, because she had learned that with Harvey, the best thing to do was to make it as easy as possible for him to say the true thing. "You told me in October that you came here and something happened that you didn't expect," he said. That the reason you couldn't do what Vance asked you to do was something that had happened to you in this house. Yes. What was it? Specifically. Georgia looked at him across the table. The fire was low in the stove, and the lamp between them made a small, warm world of the kitchen, and outside the wind was doing its winter work across the plains. She had been thinking about how to answer this question for as long as he had been thinking about how to ask it. It was several things, she said. It was Eli, the first time he let me close enough to sit beside him without moving away. It was Clara, who trusted me before she had any reason to. It was this house, which is full of someone's love even after that someone is gone, and I could feel it when I walked in the door on the first day. She paused, and it was you, specifically and particularly you, standing in the doorway listening to me read to your children and not walking away. Harvey was very still. Georgia, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. Just her name, said quietly, in the voice of a man who has been careful with words for so long that, when he finally uses one plainly, it carries everything he means by it. I know this is complicated, she said, because there were still complications. There was the question of what she was and what her role in his household was, and what the right way to proceed looked like. I know there are things that need to happen in the right order. There are, he agreed. But the order I have in mind starts with asking you whether, when everything is properly arranged, you might be willing to stay here not as a teacher but as he stopped. The words were not coming the way he wanted them, and she could see him working for them, this man who was honest to his bones and who wanted to say this right. As my wife, he finished, if you could want that. If this is a place you could want to be. The fire in the stove spoke for a moment into the silence. Harvey, Georgia said, and she reached across the table and put her hand over his, the first deliberate touch she had ever made, and she felt his hand turn under hers and hold on with a steadiness that she recognized as the essence of who he was. There is nowhere else I want to be. They were married on the 2nd of February, 1874, in the Hayden church that was no longer new enough to have tacky paint. The ceremony was conducted by the minister Georgia had traveled with on the mail coach, the one who talked incessantly about Providence, and he was, on this occasion, so thoroughly convinced of Providence's role in the proceedings that he became briefly emotional at the altar, which Eli found incomprehensible and Clara found deeply moving. Opal Dempsey from the general store attended, and Hector and Tobias from the ranch, and 3 of the neighboring ranching families who had become acquaintances of Georgia's over the months of her residency in Hayden County. Harvey stood at the altar in the best coat he owned with an expression of concentrated, serious joy that was so entirely him, so entirely devoid of performance and so full of genuine feeling, that Georgia felt tears press at the back of her eyes as she walked toward him and spent the walk down the short aisle reminding herself firmly that she was not going to cry in front of the entire county. She cried anyway. Clara cried in sympathy. Eli rolled his eyes, and then immediately tried to hide the fact that his own eyes were bright. The afternoon reception in the church hall was warm and loud, and full of the particular generosity of frontier communities that understand what it means to keep each other alive through hard winters. And Georgia found herself moved by it, by the plainness and the realness of it, so different from everything she had grown up around in the careful, stratified world of Philadelphia, and so much more like what she had always believed life could be at its best. Harvey stood beside her through the reception with his hand at the small of her back, not possessively but steadily, the way he did everything, and each time she turned to him she found him already looking at her with that expression she had first seen on him in the early autumn, the one that meant he was paying complete and unhurried attention, and she thought that being paid that kind of attention by that kind of man was one of the finest things she could imagine. Spring came early that year, a warm April that brought the grass up fast and green and made the whole of the Fairchild land, which was also now Georgia's land, look like the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something else. The children thrived. Eli, who had been so careful and contained when Georgia had first arrived, had opened by degrees over the winter into a boy who laughed loudly and argued cheerfully and displayed, with increasing confidence, a mind that was going to be remarkable when it had been given the tools it deserved. He was 10 now, reading above his years, working through arithmetic with the focused pleasure of someone who finds in numbers a satisfying kind of order. Clara was 6, and had developed an imperious confidence in the schoolroom that manifested mostly as correcting Eli's spelling at every opportunity, which he bore with an older sibling's dignified suffering. Georgia wrote to her sister Ruth in the spring and told her everything she had not said in the winter letters. She told her about Harvey, about the hearing, about the February wedding, about Eli and Clara and the schoolroom and the ranch, and the immensity of the Kansas sky. She told her about the evening readings and the kitchen table conversations, and the way Harvey looked when he came in from a long day on the range, and found her, and the children in the middle of something, that specific look she had described only to herself for months. She told her she was happy. She told her it was a particular kind of happy she had not previously known existed, the kind that is made not of the absence of difficulty, but of the presence of the right person beside you in the difficulty. Ruth wrote back 3 weeks later. The letter was long and full of joy, and several passages that made Georgia laugh aloud at the kitchen table. Ruth said she was coming to visit in the summer. Ruth said she had been corresponding with a young man in Topeka who had kind eyes in his photograph, and who was also, by what she described as Providence, a teacher. Ruth said she was beginning to understand what Georgia had been saying between the lines of her letters, and she was glad for her beyond expression. The summer letter was one of the ones Georgia folded carefully and kept in the small box under the bed where she kept the things that mattered. Harvey watched Georgia come alive in the spring the way he watched everything he cared about, with the full weight of his attention. He watched her expand from the careful, self-contained woman who had arrived on his doorstep the previous summer into someone who moved through the world with an openness he had not seen in her before. And he understood that what he was seeing was what she was like when she felt safe. And the understanding of that moved him in ways he was not always equipped to articulate but tried to show in small consistencies, the way he had learned to love from the beginning. He had one conversation with her in May that he had been working up to for some time. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, the children inside, the last of the sun laying gold across the grass. Georgia had a book in her lap but was not reading it. Harvey had his coffee but was not drinking it. The companionable silence between them had the quality of silence between people who are so comfortable with each other that they no longer need to fill space, and Georgia had closed her eyes and was listening to the meadowlarks, and Harvey was looking at her. "I've been thinking about what you said last fall," he said. "About the school." Georgia opened her eyes. "What about it?" "There are children on 6 ranches within 10 miles of here who have no access to education," Harvey said. "I know their parents. I've talked to several of them over the winter. There is interest." Georgia looked at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that there is a building on this property, the old bunkhouse, that is sitting empty since I reduced the hired crew, and that with some work it could be made into something. I'm saying that if you wanted to establish something here, a proper school, something with a real enrollment and a curriculum and a future, I think you could." He paused. "I know it's not the Philadelphia school you imagined. But I have come to believe, and I might be wrong, that you imagined it because you wanted to give something to children who needed it, not because you specifically wanted it to be in a city." Georgia looked at him for a long time. The meadowlarks went on making their case to the evening. The grass moved in the slow way of summer grass, unhurried and certain. "You want to build me a school," she said. "I want to help you build it," he said. "It would be yours. I'd just be useful with the lumber." Georgia looked out at the grass and the sky and the land that was hers as much as his, and she thought about her father, the gentle, bookish man who had believed that education was the single greatest weapon against suffering, who had taught in a city school his whole life and never had the resources to do what he dreamed of. And she thought about what he might have said if he could have seen this moment, this woman who was his daughter, sitting on the porch of a Kansas ranch house with a man who was offering to build her a school. "Yes," she said, "I want that." Harvey smiled, and it was the smile she loved most on him, the one that was not performed for anyone, that appeared only when something he cared about was happening, small and entirely real and warmer than anything else she knew how to describe. They broke ground on the schoolhouse in June, working on it in the evenings and on Sundays, Harvey and Tobias and Georgia and Eli, who was old enough and more than eager enough to be genuinely useful, and who brought to the physical work the same focused intensity he brought to his reading. Clara supervised from a safe distance and issued opinions about where the windows should go, which Harvey took more seriously than was probably strictly necessary. But the windows ended up exactly where Clara said they should be, and they were, undeniably, the right choice. Ruth arrived in July, as promised, on the very mail coach that had brought Georgia to Hayden County exactly a year before. She was 20 years old, with Georgia's dark eyes and a more immediately outgoing manner than her sister, and she took one look at Harvey Fairchild and one look at the way Harvey Fairchild looked at Georgia and made an expression at Georgia behind his back that conveyed, without a single word, every possible version of "I see what you mean." Ruth stayed 3 weeks. She fell profoundly and completely in love with the children, and with the ranch, and with the life Georgia had built, and she had several long kitchen table conversations with Harvey about land and cattle, and the practical realities of frontier life that demonstrated a quick mind, and a genuine curiosity that Harvey responded to with an openness Georgia found touching. On the last evening of her visit, sitting on the porch with a sky full of stars that the darkness of the open country made overwhelming, Ruth said to Georgia, "I thought you were building a life here. I see now that you are the life here. You are what holds this together." Georgia shook her head. "It was always here. I just helped them find it." Ruth looked at her with the perception of a younger sister who has always known exactly who her older sister is. That is the most Georgia Pritchard thing anyone has ever said. The school opened in August of 1874, on a morning that smelled of new wood and late summer grass, with 14 children from 6 ranching families sitting on the benches Georgia and Harvey had built together, and Georgia standing at the front of the room with a chalkboard behind her and her father's atlas on the desk, and an emotion in her chest so large that she had to begin speaking quickly before it overtook her. She taught them the things her father had taught her. She taught them not only reading and arithmetic and geography and history, but the practice of attention, the habit of curiosity, the understanding that to know something deeply is to become larger than you were before you knew it. She taught them that their lives on the frontier were not a limitation but a perspective, that the things they knew, the grass and the sky and the cattle and the weather, and the practical intelligence of people who must solve problems with what is at hand, were things that the wider world needed and did not always have. Harvey came to the school in the evenings after she had finished, not as the children's father but as himself, sitting in the back of the room while she went over the day's work, asking questions about the curriculum with the same genuine interest he had always brought to the kitchen table evenings. He had begun to read differently since Georgia arrived, more widely and more deliberately, working through the books on her shelves with the focused attention of a man who has discovered that there is more to learn than he had previously allowed himself time for. One evening in September, about a month into the school's operation, Georgia looked up from the lesson she was reviewing at the chalkboard and saw Harvey sitting in the back of the room with her copy of Longfellow open in his lap, and an expression on his face of such concentrated peace that she stopped what she was doing and simply looked at him for a moment. He felt her looking and raised his eyes. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Just looking." He gave her a look of mild, fond exasperation that was one of her favorite looks, and went back to his reading, and Georgia turned back to the chalkboard, with the feeling of someone standing in the exact center of where they are supposed to be. She was, by this time, certain that she was carrying their child. She had not told Harvey yet, partly because she was still adjusting to the knowledge herself, and partly because she wanted to find exactly the right moment for something that felt, in the specific landscape of their life together, like the closing of a circle. She told him on a Sunday morning in October, the anniversary of the morning when Eli had found her letter and everything had cracked open, and then, against all probability, healed into something stronger than it had been before. She told him at the kitchen table, with coffee between them and the Sunday quiet of the house around them, and she said it plainly, as she had learned from him was always the right way. Harvey went very still. He looked at her with eyes that were doing something complicated and beautiful. He put down his coffee cup very carefully. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and he sat there for a long moment without saying anything, just holding her hands with both of his, and Georgia felt the feeling move through him like weather through landscape. "Are you well?" he said finally. "Is everything is fine," she said. "I am well. We are both well." He nodded slowly. He looked at their joined hands. Then he looked up at her with an expression so full and so unguarded that Georgia thought she might carry the image of it for the rest of her life. "Georgia," he said. "Harvey," she said back in the same tone, which was nothing but love, direct and simple and completely real. "They told the children at supper." Clara's response was immediate and operatic, a burst of absolute joy that involved leaving her chair without permission and requiring several minutes to be settled back into any kind of order. Eli sat very still for a moment, in his father's way, processing. Then he looked at Georgia with eyes that were bright and careful and full of everything he never quite said aloud, and he said, "Good." That was all. Just good. In Eli Fairchild's vocabulary, it was the equivalent of a speech. The winter of 1874 went deep and hard, the kind of Kansas winter that tests everything it touches, and the Fairchild household came through it with the particular resilience of people who have learned to trust each other and to share the weight. Georgia taught through the cold months with the school closed to external students, but Eli and Clara present every day, advancing at a rate that continued to astonish her, particularly Eli, who was developing a genuinely exceptional facility with language and a mathematical intuition that she was beginning to think deserved more than she could give him. She said as much to Harvey one evening. "He should go to a proper school," she said. "Eventually. In a few years, when he's ready, there are schools in the East that would—" "I know," Harvey said. He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas talked about it, about sending me East for school. I was too attached to the land to go." He looked at the fire. "Eli is different. He has the same attachment, but he can hold both things at once." "He can," Georgia agreed. "He is remarkable, Harvey, in ways that will serve him well." Harvey looked at her with something grateful and complicated in his face. "You see him more clearly than I do sometimes. You always have." "You see him clearly," Georgia said. "You just need someone to describe what you see." Harvey looked at her for a long moment. "That's what you do," he said. "For all of us. You find the words for what was already there." Georgia thought about that, about the title she had never asked for and had arrived at by accident and effort and love, about the man across from her who had spent his whole life doing the right thing and had forgotten for 2 years that the right thing could also be the good thing, about the children upstairs who had needed someone to sit beside them and say, "You can do this," often enough, and with enough conviction that they believed it, about what her father had always said. That teaching is not the transfer of information from one mind to another. That teaching is the act of helping someone discover what they are already capable of. She had come here to teach his children. She had not expected to find a man who needed teaching of a different kind, not in facts or figures or history, but in the possibility of his own future. She had not expected to find herself in the teaching, to discover in the act of helping these 3 people open to the world a version of herself that was larger and more alive than anything she had known before. She had not expected to find this, but she had found it, and she held it with both hands. Their son was born in May of 1875, a clear morning with the windows open and the smell of new grass coming in on the breeze. Harvey was there, which was not always the custom but was entirely natural for him, because Harvey Fairchild was the kind of man who did not leave the people he loved alone in their difficult hours. The baby was healthy and loud and had Harvey's dark hair, and in the first hours of his life, an expression of concentrated seriousness that made Georgia laugh even through exhaustion. They named him Thomas James Fairchild, for Harvey's father and for Harvey himself, and it was the right name, and they both knew it the moment it was said aloud. Eli met his brother with the careful, wondering gravity that had always been his way with important things. He held the baby with the slightly terrified precision of a 10-year-old who is aware of his own responsibility and is absolutely not going to fail at it. And Harvey stood beside him with a hand on his shoulder and watched his son hold his son. And Georgia, watching them from the bed, thought that she had never in her life seen a more complete thing. Clara met her brother with the enthusiasm of someone who has been waiting for a project and has just found it. She immediately informed everyone present that she would be responsible for his education in the early years, and no one contradicted her, because when Clara Fairchild made a pronouncement, it was generally more efficient to work with her than against her. That summer, Ruth came back to Hayden County. She came with the young man from Topeka, whose name was Daniel Marsh, and whose kind eyes were accurate to the photograph, and who had indeed been a teacher and was looking, with increasing seriousness, at the possibilities of a life on the frontier. He and Harvey took to each other with the comfortable ease of men who share fundamental values and recognize it quickly, and Georgia and Ruth sat on the porch with small Thomas between them, and watched the two men walk the land together in the evening light, and said nothing for a long time, because sometimes the right response to a good thing is simply to be present in it. Ruth and Daniel were married the following spring in the same Hayden church, with the same minister, who by this time had come to regard himself as a personal instrument of the providence he had always been so ready to discuss. They settled on land 5 miles from the Fairchild Ranch, which was close enough for Sunday visits and far enough for independence, and Georgia had the particular joy of watching her sister build a life alongside her own. The school grew in the years that followed. A second room was added in 1876, as the ranching families of the region multiplied and their children accumulated. Georgia hired an assistant teacher, a young woman named Miriam from Ohio, who had Georgia's father's quality of absolute commitment to the potential in her students, and who threw herself into the work of the Hayden Frontier School with an energy that reminded Georgia pleasurably of herself. The school became known across 3 counties as the kind of institution that parents made real efforts to get their children to, because what Georgia had built was not a place where children went to be filled with facts, but a place where they went to become the people they were capable of being. Harvey built her a new classroom in 1877, working on it the way he worked on everything, steadily and without fanfare. And when it was finished, he had put a plaque beside the door that said Pritchard School in simple carved letters, because her name was the right name for it, and she had stood in front of the plaque for a long time with her hands over her mouth and Harvey beside her, saying nothing in the particular way of someone who has done a precise and complete thing and does not feel the need to add commentary. Eli left for a school in the East in 1878, at 13, on a morning that was harder than Georgia had expected, not because she was not ready for it, but because readiness and grief are not mutually exclusive. He was steady and composed at the station, his father's son, but he held Georgia for a moment longer than he held anyone else, and what he said into the top of her head was quiet and private and was entirely hers. He came back every summer. He wrote letters of extraordinary quality, long, thoughtful, curious letters that Harvey read aloud at the kitchen table in the evenings, in the tradition, Georgia had established in that first summer, and which Thomas, who was a serious and verbal child, followed with the focused attention of a boy who wants very badly to be as interesting as his older brother. Clara grew into a young woman of such specific and confident intelligence that Georgia sometimes caught herself simply watching the girl move through the world in a kind of delighted admiration. She took over the management of the younger students at the school when she was 14 with the absolute authority of someone who has never genuinely doubted herself. And Georgia let her, because the right kind of confidence, properly directed, is one of the finest educational tools there is. Little Thomas, who was not little for very long, being built along Harvey's lines and reaching Harvey's height by the time he was 12, had his mother's instinct for language and his father's instinct for land, and spent his childhood moving between the schoolroom and the range with the comfortable ease of someone who has never been made to choose between the parts of himself. In the autumn of 1879, Georgia discovered she was expecting again. She told Harvey in the kitchen, in the morning with coffee, in the way she had told him everything that mattered. He received the news with the same quality of stillness and love that he had received it with the first time, and she thought that it was one of the gifts of being with someone for 5 years, that you knew exactly how they would receive the news that mattered, and that this one received all news that mattered with everything he had. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1880, the year the spring came in soft and easy across the Kansas grasslands, and they named her Ruth Clara Fairchild, for Georgia's sister, and for the woman Harvey had loved before Georgia had arrived to teach him that it was possible to love again. Ruth Clara was a different child from the first two, quieter and more watchful, with Harvey's gray eyes and a quality of careful attention that felt familiar to Georgia in ways that were profoundly moving. She grew up watching and thinking and seeing things before she said them, and when she said them, they were worth waiting for. The children grew up, and the school grew, and the land continued to be what it was, which was not simply property but home, not simply history but present, not simply something that had been fought for but something that was being made every day by the people who lived on it and loved it and taught each other what it meant to be alive in it. There was an evening in the late summer of 1882, the summer when Thomas was 7, and Ruth Clara was 2, and Eli was home from the East for the season, and Clara was 17, and thinking about her own future with the characteristic decisiveness of someone who has always known exactly who she is, and the whole family was together on the porch in the long late light. Harvey was in the chair he had occupied every evening for 8 years, and Georgia was beside him with Ruth Clara on her lap, and Thomas was playing in the yard with the focused intensity of a 7-year-old, who has invented a game so complex that no one else can follow the rules. And Eli was reading, and Clara was braiding her hair and explaining to Eli why his reading material was inferior to what she would have chosen, and Harvey's hand was on Georgia's. And the meadowlarks were doing what they always did in the last hour before dark. Georgia looked out at the land and thought about the morning she had arrived, dusty and uncertain, and carrying a secret that had felt like a stone she was wearing around her neck, looking at a man by a fence with the look of someone who had decided to carry everything alone. She thought about the kitchen table and the letter and the confrontation that had torn something open, and then let it heal better. She thought about the school and the children and the evenings and the coffee and the years. She thought about what her father had said, that teaching is helping someone discover what they are already capable of. Harvey turned his head and looked at her, the way he had been looking at her for 8 years with complete and unhurried attention, and he said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Georgia said, "that I came here to teach." "You did," he said, "and I think I've done a reasonably good job of it." Harvey looked at the yard where Thomas had just redesigned his game and was explaining the new rules to a beetle with great seriousness. He looked at Clara, who was telling Eli with complete authority about the relative merits of their reading material. He looked at the school building across the yard, solid and right, with its plaque and its 2 classrooms and its full enrollment and its future. He looked at Ruth Clara, who had fallen asleep on Georgia's lap with her face turned toward the evening light. Then he looked back at Georgia with the small, entirely real smile that was his and hers alone. "Reasonably good," he said, with the dry, warm understatement that was one of his most particular qualities, and that Georgia had loved from the moment she first heard it. "I'd say a little better than that." Georgia laughed, and Harvey kept hold of her hand, and the light went long and golden across the Kansas grass, and the meadowlarks sang their specific, repeated song into the cooling air, and everything was settled and complete and entirely, perfectly right. The life they had built was not the one either of them had planned. Georgia had planned to go to a man's ranch, observe what could be observed, collect what she had been sent to collect, and return to Philadelphia with enough money to fix what was broken and start something new. Harvey had planned to get through the days in their necessary order, to raise his children as well as he could, to protect his land, and to hold himself together by the strength of deliberate habit. Neither of them had planned for the other. Neither of them had planned to be changed, fundamentally and completely, by someone who arrived in their life looking like something simple and turned out to be the most necessary thing. She had been hired to teach his children. She had taught them, and she had gone on teaching them, and the school she had built in the old bunkhouse of a Kansas cattle ranch was teaching more children than she could have imagined on that first June morning, when the mail coach had rattled up the road through the gold and green grass. But somewhere in the teaching, in the evenings by the fire and the coffee on the kitchen table, and the confrontations and the honesty, and the long, deliberate process of two people who had both been hurt by the world deciding to trust it again, something else had happened. She had taught him to open what he had shut. She had taught him that the future was not a betrayal of the past, but its continuation. She had taught him that joy was not disloyal and that love was not a risk but a homecoming, and he had taught her. He had taught her what it looked like when a man meant what he said. He had taught her that a home is not a building but a practice, a daily choosing, a set of hands willing to do the work. He had taught her that the land she stood on was as much hers as anyone's, that she had as much right as anyone to stake a claim and hold it with everything she had. They had taught each other. That was the truth of it, simple and complete. Harvey James Fairchild and Georgia Pritchard Fairchild sat on the porch of their ranch house in the long Kansas evening with their children around them and their life in front of them. And it was everything, and it was enough, and it was real.